You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 19th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 2 a.m. in Pyongyang, 2000 in Beirut, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Hezbollah Secretary-General Hassan Nasrallah threatens vengeance as Israel strikes Lebanon through more orthodox means. North Korea tests a bunch more rockets. Is it just because nobody is paying attention to them? And should people being paid six-figure salaries of public money buy their own clothes? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests John Everard and Carol Walker will discuss the day's big stories, and this week's letter from is posted from Portugal. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by John Everard, former British diplomat, ambassador specifically to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea, and Carol Walker, Times Radio presenter, political commentator. This far into the show, Carol, and I can't say the word commentator. It's just as well we have a professional broadcaster at the table, i.e. you, in case I trip over any further four-syllable words. And former BBC correspondent. Hello to you both.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, good evening to you, Andrew. Good to be here.
Carol, you have recently been in Spain, which we're not going to be talking about later, despite their hugely entertaining diplomatic row this week with Portugal. But that's another story for another time. What were you doing in Spain?
I have to say, Andrew, that most of my time there was spent actually chilling out a bit with the family, but we were not too far from Barcelona, and several members of the family have connections there, have worked there. And what was fascinating was that Carles Puigdemont, the exiled Catalan leader, had just recently nipped back into Barcelona, sparking all these stories about a huge police hunt which somehow failed to prevent him actually appearing outside the main Parliament building in the centre of Barcelona, delivering a speech about keeping the flame of Catalan independence alive, and then apparently just getting into the back of a car and leaving again. And there were some fascinating insights into the way that many of the authorities, I think, were not actually trying that hard to stop him somehow.
John, you, and this will come up later in the show, have recently been attending one of those periodic How Do You Solve a Problem Like Korea conferences.
Yes, absolutely. Every year, the South Korean Ministry of Unification brings together people who they think might be able to offer useful advice, and we chew over the cud, discuss what we're going to do about Korea, how are we going to ever establish the reunification of the peninsula. It's a bit sad because it tends to be the same people each year, and it's got to the stage now where I can just about join in everybody else's punchlines. This year, it was enlightened, if that's the word, by the fact that 72 hours before the conference, the organisers realised they only had one woman in all the panels. Of course, panic ensued, and the all-woman team who'd put the conference together had to be nudged by the grey-suited middle-aged men in the ministry into inviting more women. At 72 hours' notice, the poor women involved, of course, just got told to come and had to rush their presentations, rather. But it added a bit of sparkle to an event.
I mean, that's almost heartwarming in some respects.
Yes, I stress the word almost.
It does seem like something you should notice rather earlier than 72 hours before kick-off, though.
Other people around the conference expressed that very same thought in even more forcible language.
Well, we will have more from both of you shortly, but we start in Lebanon, where we may have an answer to the question of whether the incapacitation of thousands of Hezbollah members with exploding pagers and walkie-talkies was a precursor to wider action. Within the last couple of hours, Israel has struck what it claims are Hezbollah-related targets in southern Lebanon. At the same time, Hezbollah Secretary-General Hassan Nasrallah was speaking, and at some length, on television about this week's attacks. Here is a very small section of what Nasrallah had to say.
Thousands of pages were targeted by the Israeli enemy. The enemy violated through this attack all the regulations, laws and red lines.
Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and there was considerable distance more where that came from. We're joined now by Middle East correspondent Greg Karlstrom. Greg, first of all, to these Israeli airstrikes occurring in the last few hours, do they seem like the beginning of something big? They're obviously very far from the first such raids in the last year or so, arguably in the last 20 or 30 years or so, but do they seem like an escalation?
No, they don't. They seem like a continuation of what Israel has been doing until now, and they seem like a bit of psychological warfare. The fact that you had not just airstrikes in the south of Lebanon, but Israeli jets flying over the capital, flying over Beirut, breaking the sound barrier while Nasrallah was speaking, I think was meant as, again, a bit of psychological warfare aimed at the Lebanese population, but not an escalation of the fighting.
I mean, it's likely that Nasrallah didn't actually hear any of this. We don't know precisely where he is, but I think we can assume it is a considerable distance underground. Other than the bit we said about him expressing his indignation at the means by which Hezbollah were attacked earlier this week, did he express anything new or significant?
Not really. He spoke for a long time, but he said very little in that time. I think the one sort of newsworthy headline from it was he insisted that Hezbollah would not stop firing rockets at Israel until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. There have been some Israeli officials over the past few days who thought they could decouple these two fronts, who thought they could hit Hezbollah hard enough in Lebanon that it would have to admit defeat and it would have to agree to a separate ceasefire independent of Gaza. Nasrallah said that wasn't going to happen. Aside from that, the rest of the speech, it was very tired. It was very subdued. At one point, he sort of went on a riff about how, you win some, you lose some. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It was a speech that, for many people watching it in Lebanon, it was widely mocked in Lebanon by people watching it.
Which Nasrallah obviously will not like. Do we get a sense of how diminished / embarrassed he and his organisation are by what happened this week?
I think it's fair to say they're deeply humiliated. Even in his speech, he called this a big defeat for Hezbollah. He said it was the biggest blow the group had suffered in many, many years, and that it was. I mean, in terms of manpower, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of militiamen who have been injured, some of them quite seriously. People have lost eyes, lost fingers, hands in these explosions. And so the group is diminished in that sense. Its communications network is in shambles right now. It will find it, I think, very difficult to coordinate any sort of large-scale attacks against Israel if it were so inclined. So it is, I think, a very serious blow, both in tangible terms and then also to the prestige and the standing of Hezbollah.
You said that some of the reaction, at least within Lebanon, had been unsympathetic. What sense do you get of how this is going or how this is playing across the wider region? Because Hezbollah do rather lack for fans, especially in the Sunni Arab countries.
They do. I mean, I think there are certainly a lot of officials or policymakers in the Gulf states, for example, who would never say this in public, but who were not displeased to see thousands of Hezbollah militiamen being injured in these explosions. So there are some parts of the region where this has elicited chuckles at the very least. And then, in other countries, in places like Iraq and Syria, places where you have also very powerful Iranian-backed militias, there is a feeling of panic right now. There is a concern that, if Hezbollah's pagers and walkie-talkies were sabotaged, then what about our own devices? And so I would imagine there are a lot of these groups across the Middle East right now sort of frantically looking at their own electronics gear.
Greg Karlstrom, thank you for joining us. We'll bring our panel in now, Carol Walker and John Everard. John, first of all, if we look back to the events of the last couple of days, day one we saw thousands of pages exploding across Lebanon and Syria. Day two, it seemed to be mostly walkie-talkies, although explosions were reported in other electrical devices. In the annals of espionage, where does this rank? It is an extraordinary endeavour.
Yes, extraordinary endeavour. Nicely summed up. I don't think we've seen anything quite like this anywhere before. And people have gone back through Israeli history, pointing out that Mossad and Shin Bet's use of remote explosions to kill people. There's a lot of history behind it, but not on this scale. Remember 1996 when they killed one of the key figures of the Palestinian Liberation Organization through the base unit of its mobile phone exploding. That was just one person, and that has gone down in Shin Bet history. Thousands like this, hundreds killed, many more wounded. No, never been done before. The Israelis, I suspect, are feeling just a little bit pleased with themselves right now. They've scored quite a coup in technical terms.
Carol, does it or will Israel be hoping, and it may be a forlorn hope, that this improves their recent image on the world stage at least? They have been criticised, and not unreasonably, for operating extremely indiscriminately in Gaza. This, though there have been civilian casualties and civilian fatalities, does seem to be rather more precisely targeted.
Yeah, it's clear that Israel was targeting Hezbollah personnel, and many of those who were killed and maimed were part of the network. But we know that there were at least 2 children killed when pagers and walkie-talkies exploded. I think when you look at Benjamin Netanyahu's behaviour, increasingly he simply is looking at his own survival and how he can get through this. He does, of course, need the support of the United States, but I think he's increasingly prepared to defy them. And what Israel has succeeded in doing here is to spread not fear and uncertainty, not just as has been apparent on the streets of Beirut and other Lebanese cities today, but much more widely, because as John was remarking, your correspondent was saying, other enemies of Israel in other parts of the Middle East will be wondering which parts of their communications networks have been compromised. It was not just unprecedented, but very audacious. And the Israelis appear to have succeeded, at least in the short term, in making it much harder for Hezbollah to launch any kind of serious attack on Israel, although those cross-border raids will undoubtedly continue. But of course, the communication for planning further phases has been seriously undermined. I think what nobody, even those incredibly close to the Israeli thinking on this, is clear about is whether this was intended as the first phase of some bigger offensive into southern Lebanon to push Hezbollah out, to create a buffer zone so that Israelis can go back into northern Israel. And of course, the other big question is what not just Hezbollah, but its backers Iran might do in retaliation.
Well, indeed. John, there has been considerable journalistic effort expended over the last 48 hours trying to figure out how exactly the Israelis did this, and we still don't have the full picture, but it does seem apparent that they did establish some sort of front organisation or front company. It may even be the case that not only, to add further insult to injury, that Hezbollah may literally have bought the bombs that have incapacitated their organisation more or less directly from Mossad. But it's not that unusual, though, is it, as an intelligence technique? The British Army famously operated a mobile laundry in Belfast in the early 1970s, scouring the soiled clothes of IRA suspects for explosives residue. And it turned out that one of the biggest cipher machine companies in Europe, Crypto AG, recently had been owned more or less wholesale by the CIA all along.
Yes, there are sort of indirect precedents of that kind. But to get yourself into the supply chain in this way, to somehow insert yourself, it seems, between a Taiwanese and a company and a Hungarian contractor, to the extent that you can actually insert explosives into thousands of phones. That's a one-off. That hasn't been done before. The sheer scale of the operation is quite staggering.
And just finally on this, Carol, and we did touch on this with Greg, we talked a bit about Israel's reputation as well. This does not do wonders for Hezbollah's, does it? Because they have framed themselves for years as the tip of the spear in terms of resistance to Israel, and they look somewhat foolish at the moment.
Their vulnerability has clearly been exposed, and Israel's extraordinary technical and planning processes and the way that it's managed to insert those into Hezbollah and to infiltrate its crucial communication network. I mean, they were only using walkie-talkies and pagers because people knew that their phones could be
well, indeed. Israel, as we have been talking about this week, the country which developed the Pegasus spyware.
Yeah, Hezbollah has undoubtedly been undermined. Israel will clearly see this militarily as a success. But I think the big worry that there will be now is what will happen in terms of the retaliation. In the short term, Hezbollah may find it very difficult to do anything other than lob a few missiles over the border. But there have been these questions for quite some time about what Iran was going to do, about a previous Israeli strike on Iranian territory. Iran appeared to be holding off because there was at least the prospect of progress in peace talks in Gaza. It's very difficult to see how those peace talks can go anywhere now. And I think the question is, when Israel talks about a new phase in the war, is it just talking about changing its focus towards securing that northern border with Lebanon, or does it intend to go beyond that? And would that actually then risk Iran not wanting to allow Israel to make such inroads?
I think it's important to understand that Iran is deeply reluctant to see any escalation for very strong domestic reasons. I mean, it's not so long ago that the Iranian regime was deeply fearful that it would face a popular revolt. And since that time, the economy has gone from bad to worse. They have a lot of missiles, it's true, but they have great difficulty keeping their own people happy. Now, one important bit of the background to what Israel's done is that this week, for the first time in many years, oil has gone below $70 a barrel. So Iran's principal export is simply not bringing in the cash that they've become accustomed to. They are in deep economic problems, and right now they really, really don't want anything to flare up.
Well, sticking with the theme of truculent militants given to threats to rain hellfire upon their enemies to the south, North Korea claims to have successfully tested an exciting new range of missiles, including one which boasts a super-large conventional warhead, an obvious improvement on the merely large. North Korean state media outlet KCNA vouchsafed the satisfaction of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who, it says here, said that such tests and steady improvement of performance of weapons and equipment through them are directly related to the grave threat of outside forces to the state security environment of the DPRK. John, when he talks about grave threat of outside forces, this is a refrain that the DPRK has been, well, touting pretty much since it was founded. Do North Koreans still buy it? Do they still really think that the whole outside world, assuming that they know there is one, is ganging up on them?
Some do, some don't. I mean, there are internal debates in North Korea to a greater extent than is perhaps widely understood. Whether Kim Jong-un believes that, I think, is open to all kinds of questions. Note that the missile that he tested with this super large warhead, by now Vostok's last, was a 320-kilometre range. So we are not here talking about a missile that can reach the continental United States. When he talks about hostile forces, he's talking here about South Korea, which fits into a long-standing pattern of increasingly hostile rhetoric against South Korea. And one of the big worries is that he is actually girding up to restart the Korean War. He started in 2021 a 5-year military modernization program, which has gone gangbusters, to quote a famous British political phrase. He's tested all kinds of weapons, including the other day not just the medium-range missile, but a brand new cruise missile. And the fear is that when this program is completed, he will feel able credibly to threaten South Korea with being overrun militarily unless or until it coughs up vast amounts of money, and perhaps even then. It's quite a grim prospect. The test of the missiles that we saw yesterday, of course, follows hard on the heels of a bone-chilling visit to his own uranium enrichment facility just outside Pyongyang. We know where it is now, where the machines he's using are modern, extremely efficient, and are probably generating uncomfortably large amounts of weapons-grade uranium.
Carol, does it strike us, though, that the missile tests, which obviously do generate an amount of publicity, are, well, to an extent, basically that every so often the North Koreans worry that nobody's paying them enough attention, and this is just their way of reminding us all that they're there?
Well, there clearly is an element of showing defiance here, excuse me, on the part of the North Korea leader. But I'm sorry, I'll just sip some water and then I'll resume.
John, we can pick something up with you.
I'm back again.
No, Carol's back.
And also this demonstration by Kim Jong-un that despite the sanctions, he's been able to develop this quite sophisticated program. And I think what is further troubling many Western countries is the fact that, of course, North Korea's dictator has been getting together with his Russian chum, President Putin. And whilst there was initially, I think, perhaps some rather dismissive comments about, well, what on earth is North Korea going to give to Russia? Of course, Russia does need some pretty basic missiles and ammunition, and North Korea almost certainly can provide that. And secondly, there are these wider questions about how much nuclear technology components and other bits of hardware the two leaders have been exchanging.
John, do we know how seriously serious people take North Korea potentially as a military force? Because there turned out to be 2.5 years ago a fairly large gap between what people imagined the Russian military was capable of and what it turned out the Russian military actually was capable of, i.e. it's 2.5 years later, and for all that the Russians have hurled at Ukraine, they have taken barely any more territory than they held 2.5 years ago. Is it possible that in the kind of scenario you were describing, i.e. North Korea fancying its chances, they might well get found out?
I think that as far as the North Korean conventional forces are concerned, what you've just said about Russia applies in spades. They are undertrained, under-equipped, and often simply underfed. North Korean soldiers that I saw did look pretty skinny, and you wouldn't want to make them carry any kind of heavy weaponry around. But that's not the immediate threat. One of the things that Kim Jong-un said proudly, announcing this very successful test of his super large war-headed missile, was that this increases North Korea's capability for preemptive strikes. He's not talking about defence here. He's talking about starting the war. So with his conventional forces in some disarray, the risk is that he feels able to use his tactical nuclear weapons to obliterate the US forces in South Korea, key points in the South Koreans' own military, and then swarm. His army is, as I say, under-equipped and everything, but it's very large, and simply throwing that number of people across the border, as the Russians have shown, can be effective.
Just finally, John, and just going back to that conference you were discussing, the sort of regular confab on the future of Korea, given everything we've been talking about, does anybody still talk about the prospect of a peaceful reunification of the peninsula, or is the thing now people are just kind of hoping that one day the North Korean dictatorship will just collapse, as dictatorships very often do, very often very suddenly, and very often to everybody's complete surprise?
We have to keep talking about reunification because the South Korean government has an entire ministry dedicated to it. I mean, I'm often reminded of Monty Python Ministry of City Walks, but that's by the by. So, but do serious observers believe this is going to happen? I think there is room for real doubt. The North Koreans have made abundantly clear they have no intention of allowing themselves to be taken over by the South. And this goes not just for the leadership, but for this North Korean populace in general. These are proud people. They don't want to be just the South's backyard. They have their own national pride at stake. Kim Jong-un, of course, has been busy working away at his own plan for reunification, but not of the peaceful kind.
Well, let's look closer to home and what appears promisingly like the first semi-scandal of the premiership of UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. A survey by Sky News of bungs and benefits trousered by MPs over the last 5 years ranks Sir Keir as comfortably the most comfortable with accepting freebies, clearing 100 grand's worth, mostly in football and concert tickets and suits and glasses, nearly 40 grand worth from just one donor, the television impresario Lord Ali. Carol, first of all, and I looked it up, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom clears 160 grand, doesn't have to pay rent, and to be honest, anybody who does that job is never going to find themselves scratching about for a quid afterwards. Fundamentally, should he be buying his own damn suits?
Well, technically speaking, Andrew, so long as you declare all these things and there's a register of interests where all of this has to be openly declared, he's not actually breaching any rules. But the gifts, the freebies that you've mentioned there are just part of it. There's also been the thousands of pounds worth of clothes given to his wife, Lady Starmer. He was late declaring that, so he got a bit of a rap over the knuckles for that. I think the problem for Keir Starmer, who is, after all, a Labour Prime Minister, is that he has just been telling us ever since, and even before he was elected, how tight the nation's finances are. He's already announced some pretty unpopular moves, including scrapping winter fuel payments for pensioners, and yet he's happily accepting £100,000 worth of gifts. And it frankly doesn't quite send out the sort of signal that you would want to send out if you're a Prime Minister who's talked about returning government to being in the service of the people and having standards of integrity in contrast to the previous Conservative governments, as he put it, during his election campaign. So I think that there is a lot of anger about this. A lot of MPs within his party are frankly pretty furious about it, because I think they will see that it absolutely intensifies the kind of backlash they're getting from some of their voters who are about losing this £300 winter fuel payment, which is being taken away from some pretty poor pensioners. And I think that is the problem Keir Starmer's facing. I should just mention one other issue with all of this is he's been defending his use of going to a box when he goes to see Arsenal Football Club, which is his favourite team. And he is a lifelong football fan, saying, well, look, it causes security problems if I go and sit in the stands, which obviously I'd much rather do. But we've also got proposals to overhaul the regulation of football in the UK. The Football Association, the football authorities are lobbying hard against it. And if at the same time he's being given freebies to come and by the football authorities who are themselves fighting against these regulations, it does raise a few questions about a potential appearance of a conflict of interest.
Well, the question it raises in my mind, John, is the one about, do we think anybody has ever furnished a politician with a nice new suit or tickets to the football purely and simply out of the goodness of their heart with no expectation or hope of anything in return?
This question stings. One of the dreadful facts of being a British ambassador is that you do not get free clothes. My wife discovered to her fury that her French counterpart, the wife of the French ambassador, was regularly being fitted out by the top French couture houses just so that their dresses got picked up in diplomatic magazine photographs, whereas she had to go to Marks and Spencer all the time. So, yes, it hurts a little bit. On my own receipt of gifts, in the interest of full disclosure for our listeners, I used, as you know, to run the panel of experts for the United Nations on North Korea, which contained a Chinese member who, in the best traditions of Chinese bureaucrats, used to give me presents. And I remember one famous occasion where he came back from China and gave me half a Chinese chicken, which I accepted with a kind of the fixed smile required in such circumstances, reported duly to the United Nations ethics committee who deliberated for something like a month on the propriety of chicken receipts in the context of panels of experts, and finally agreed that I could actually eat the thing, by which I'm afraid it had gone really rather rubbery.
I will acknowledge at this point the receipt of a very nice tote bag by whatever they call the Prime Minister of San Marino. It's in white. It has the crest of San Marino in silver, but I don't think, at least I'd like to think, Carol, it has not corrupted me untowardly.
Listen, I came away from the Liberal Democrat Party conference with a free cookie with a picture of Sir Ed Davey on it. So full disclosure there.
Did you eat it?
I took one bite and that was enough.
I mean, this runs deeper than I thought. But Carol, I think this is one of those. It's one of the very few things on which I do find myself having quite a sort of absolutist lemon-sucking opinion, which is that I will hear the argument absolutely that our elected representatives should be paid more, but I tend to think that while we're paying them, they shouldn't be working for anybody else.
I think the other question here is judgment. The other row that we've got at Westminster at the moment is the fact that Keir Starmer's chief of staff, his main advisor, a lady called Sue Gray, has actually been given a salary that's higher than the Prime Minister's. And you would think that if he's got an advisor that's paid that well, she might say to him, look, when you're inflicting all this pain and suffering on the voters, you're not changing the rules on benefits for people who have more than 2 children. You're cutting fuel payments from pensioners. This is not the moment for you to be seen to be accepting lavish gifts. And I think it is that appearance and that question of judgment which comes into this. Even in the days of Boris Johnson, his wife Carrie used to borrow clothes and would pay to borrow clothes for a particular occasion and then give them back. Whereas Lady Starmer seems to have accepted gifts of some great looking dresses. I'm sure I'd be tempted if I was offered them. But I think that is just one of the questions that are raised by this, and at a time that we're coming up to a budget when there's going to be a lot more pain inflicted on voters, to be seen to be enjoying so many gifts and hospitality like this is certainly not helping Keir Starmer standing with the public.
See, John, just finally on this, and I do want to go back to that point you were making about the rules that govern what actual, non-elected public servants can and cannot take. It's just the case that there is not, that I can see. I mean, maybe we can wear the thing about, yes, it's a massive hassle to everybody else if he goes to the football, and there's no reason why the Prime Minister shouldn't go to the football. But if I can see that, OK, if he goes to the football, it's just a massive headache and it's easier to sit in a corporate box. Fine, OK. But the suits and the glasses thing, there's not really a justification for any of that, is there?
No, I think you are struggling. I think Carol made a few very good points just now, that, even Starmer's wife accepting the possession of these dresses where previous Prime Minister's wives hadn't sends a very bad signal. And what is wrong with ordinary bought suits? I mean, most of us manage to get through life with these. And and some people actually manage to present themselves reasonably well. Why does the Prime Minister have to have fantastically expensive clothes when actually all he needs to do is to look reasonably presentable?
I should just say that there is one other suggestion that he may have received free Oasis tickets, and anyone listening in this country
in that case,
know
he has my every sympathy.
There was an enormous scramble for Oasis tickets, so I think he can take a word of advice now that if he does rock up in the front row of an Oasis concert, he's going to be in for quite a backlash.
Carol Walker and John Everard, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, this week's letter from is postmarked Portugal.
Working as a freelance journalist, you often feel like you're slightly in your own time zone and out of kilter with the seasons. In the periods when everyone else is heading off on holiday, you're gladly hoovering up cover shifts and commissions, squirreling away funds for the quieter winter months. And so after a busy few months covering staffers' leave, I jetted off myself to Portugal to enjoy a last gasp of European summer. Flying into Faro Airport, the soil of the continent's most southwesterly region looked more parched than I'd ever seen it, evidence of how hot and dry the season had been. Stepping off the Airbus A320 after the wettest summer in the UK for a decade, that first rush of heat and salty sea air hit me pleasantly on the way to the terminal. Inside, I was once again thankful to be a dual national EU citizen, dodging a lengthy queue with fellow Brits thanks to Brexit. Through into the baggage reclaim hall, I was struck by 3 counter but arguably interconnected messages. The first set of advertisements were for water parks, filled with images of families enjoying flumes and slides, with complex water pumping systems to shoot you up, down and all around. The second set, in juxtaposition, warned about the severe drought in the region, using the slogan, "Be a futurist, save water." They informed those with holiday homes of a hosepipe ban and encouraged visitors to preserve water by, for instance, taking shorter showers. The third set of adverts were invitations for those with the requisite financial health to move to Portugal to enjoy its culture and sunny climate, but inevitably put more pressure on infrastructure and resources, I thought. Through arrivals, the same contrasting advertisements for water parks and water conservation battled for space along motorway billboards. Whilst every few kilometres the arid terrain was punctured with bursts of spectacular greenery, golf courses, oases of carefully irrigated and manicured fairways, thirsty thoroughbred grasses, potted with the odd bunker and aquatic obstacle. The water to maintain them is, though, independently sourced by the clubs themselves, from borehole systems deep underground. Engineering solutions like this, scaled up, are increasingly being viewed as the only way to adapt to a hotter and drier climate. Building more dams and even expensive to operate desalination plants extracting water from the sea are all being considered in Portugal. One such dam, the Alquiva, completed in 2015, was intended to help combat drought in the region. It irrigates an area roughly the size of New York City, and it was hoped would guarantee water supply for locals through dry spells. But unexpectedly, the dam has encouraged outside investment to convert traditionally drier farming and grazing lands into hundreds of square kilometres of almond trees and avocado plantations. The transition has sparked public outrage against the growth of these non-native, water-intensive crops. Farmers claim avocados are no thirstier than the already present citrus fruits and don't require any herbicides or pesticides. The changed landscape from the Alquiva Dam obviously brings economic benefits and potentially tax receipts to fund more water resilience schemes. But public opinion about the way this water is being used is strong. And this is where the political, not atmospheric climate comes into play, and particularly concerns over that third advert from Baggage Reclaim. Who gets to live where? With more people moving to Portugal, retirees and digital nomads lured by enticing visa schemes, infrastructure like water supplies comes under even greater pressure. So the country's politicians have been calling for more help from Brussels. However, an EU action plan on water scarcity was shelved earlier this year, following an anti-green backlash ahead of bloc-wide elections. The political weather in 2024, billed as the world's biggest year for democracy, has been stormy and often surprising. You would have hoped that given the unprecedented levels of voting, there would have perhaps in turn been unprecedented levels of wider discussion about the health of our planet too. But time and again, the climate change issue seems to have been pushed aside and deprioritised. The dominant theme in US and European elections, pushed by networked far-right politicians and parties, has been instead immigration. Who should be allowed to come to Europe, to roam unimpeded across it, building lives in its free and relatively safe societies? Germany, sitting at the heart of the continent between 9 countries, has more border frontiers than any other European nation. Indeed, the Schengen Agreement, which originated freedom of movement, was signed in Schengen, a corner of Luxembourg I grew up in, the geographic tripoint between that country, France and Germany. After the signing, a tree was planted on that spot, l'Arbre de Trois Frontières, with a plaque bearing the 3 nations and the EU's flags. An arborous symbol which has grown as the Schengen area has flourished to hundreds of thousands across 29 nations, felling hard borders since 1985. But this week, some were left wondering if that tree might be wilting, with Germany reintroducing border control measures in response to growing tensions over immigration, feeding the rise of the far-right Alternative for Deutschland. They and kindred far-right parties like Reform in the UK, National Rally in France and Viktor Orban's Fidesz have long disparaged climate science and use the imagery of coming floods of immigrants to garner votes against porous national frontiers. But it's the actual weather, not the political forecasting, which is shocking the continent awake this week. As borders firm, the summer's extreme heat waves left terrain physically hard and non-porous too, perfect conditions for flooding. Storm Boris has brought record levels of rainfall and snow to Austria, the Czech Republic, Poland and Romania, causing widespread flooding. Slovakia and Hungary are likely to be affected in the coming days, with capitals Bratislava and Budapest both preparing for possible flooding as the River Danube rises. Lives have been lost, infrastructure, homes and businesses have been destroyed. Whilst experts are reluctant to say definitively these floods are as a result of climate change, they point to the fact that warmer air can hold more moisture, about 7% more for every 1 degree Celsius of temperature rise, leading to heavier rainfall. Meanwhile, back in southern Europe, they're praying for rain, as Portugal and Spain's parched earth has seen hundreds of wildfires igniting. Thousands of firefighters have been tackling these blazes, and requests for support have seen the EU sending 8 firefighting planes to douse the flames. When they've extinguished and the floods have receded, having ignored these national boundaries, perhaps it's a moment for Europe to take stock. Individual choices like that quick shower and paying to offset emissions of that Airbus that took me to Portugal might help balance things off. But 2024 is on track to surpass 2023 as the warmest year in recorded history. Climate change is no doubt a complex problem, but on the path to solving it through human ingenuity, it's surely not wise, as we saw earlier this year, with those EU water resilience plans, to shelve them for perceived short-term political gains.
Vincent McAvenny in Portugal. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, John Everard and Carol Walker, also to Greg Karlstrom at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Germani. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.